Shall we?
We shall. I'm recording.
Okay. All right. So we are starting this week on our journey through the classic texts of politics and society. We have wrapped up. We did two books of Aristotle's Politics, but essentially they've covered two thinkers. Now we're entering into a third, Saint Augustine,
Mm-hmm.
and we are working through selections of the City of God. Do you want me to just do sort of a little intro on what I know about Augustine?
Sure.
So his dates are 354 to 430. So we're making a huge leap then in thinkers, but we'll have to do that anyway.
Mm-hmm.
From Aristotle, who's still BC, and we have our first sort of thinker in the post Jesus. So we have all of those things developing in terms of the spread of this initially small Jewish cult at one point, or sect, into a major power within the Roman Empire. And so that's sort of a cool element because both Christian and I are pretty well versed on the New Testament, given our religious background. So all that stuff is essentially, happened and written in the first century,
Mm-hmm.
AD. And that becomes important for the likes of Augustine because you have Christianity that is originally a marginalized religion in the Roman Empire, meaning not only marginalized but also illegal. And then you have a slow turning to where the gospel message, ends up spreading vastly within the empire and among the lower ranks, and then slowly you get converts among the upper ranks, those holding political power. And to jump ahead a little bit, but I think it's in 325 or the 300s at some point. You have the emperor at that point, Constantine, who converts to Christianity. This becomes huge because not only does he have a personal conversion, he also then makes Christianity a legal religion among three possible legal religions in Rome, or the Roman Empire, I should say. The three legal religions then were the pagan religion, which becomes very important for the City of God. And that was the longest one that was practiced. And then they tolerated Judaism as well, which is interesting. The Rome tolerating Judaism is sort of hit or miss because sometimes they would Romans would just sack or terrorize a Jewish community, but then at times, by and large, they would tolerate the practice of Judaism, which obviously would be important for Jews living in the empire. But then Christianity is added to it. So you have three legal religions, but then after some time, it is made the sole religion, banning then the pagan religion and also Judaism.
Mm.
I'm not sure if that's Constantine doing that or if that's Theodosius, who's the emperor that follows him. But nonetheless, that's important because that's the Middle Ages, which is basically a 1,000-year period, roughly 500 to 1500, where the sole religion in the Western world is Christianity. So that's all, like, from a political perspective, it's huge. To sort of imagine a emperor instituting one religion and how that changes the political world. Augustine's hugely important for a number of reasons, but I don't want to, suck up the time here.
Mm-hmm.
But he's at the cusp then of this transition. Of course, he wouldn't have known that. We wouldn't have known that if we were living at the time. But looking back, we could say that of the transition from antiquity, so the Greco-Roman ancient world, to the Middle Ages. He's like right there. If the Middle Ages roughly starts around 500, he dies around 430. He is an interesting character on a number of fronts. Very good education, educated in rhetoric, loved Cicero, is allegedly uh, an expert with the Latin language. Apparently, though, and he talks about this in his Confessions, which is the other classic we're not reading, but another one of his classics, he struggled with Greek and was never able to master it, which is rare for an individual of that stature and intellectual caliber not to have gotten his Greek down. And he admits it, too, that he struggled with it. Lived a life, this all comes out of Confessions now, lived sort of the life of a playboy, and a ladies' man early on, dabbles in a number of different philosophical schools that were available at that time, and then is really riddled with a sense of guilt, which comes up in the Confessions. And after he tries out a number of different, as it were, religions, in particular one called Manichaeanism, he finds it wanting. It's lacking in some regard, and then makes a major conversion to Christianity. And that defines his life from that point on. So he's like a lot of converts can be. He's very in earnest about being a good Christian. And I think you could probably see this from our reading that we did in book 1. He knows his Bible very, very well at that point. Of note, he's also in a position of power. So he's not just a convert and sort of this intellectual, but he's in a position of power as a bishop of Hippo, and I believe Hippo is would have been in the northern part of Africa, and that becomes important because he's got political clout as well as this religious conviction. So some people consider him to be the first Christian philosopher because he's got he's not just doing religion, let's say, or just practicing it, but he's also utilizing it to understand the world in a broader philosophical sense, with a particular metaphysics, and a particular epistemology, and obviously a particular ethical outlook. His leaning between the two readers or philosophers we have read, and I mentioned this before, I think, that sort of the one historian or philosopher in the 20th century said that all philosophy throughout the ages is but a footnote to Plato and Aristotle, that a lot of schools of philosophy that developed after them lean in one direction or the other. He leans Platonic. And that's sort of important to know. And you can pick that up a bit in the City of God. To shift to the City of God real quickly, clearly this is a reaction to Rome being sacked by the Visigoths.
Yes.
And if I recall, these are our people, Christian. These are Germanic. These are Germanic barbarians in 410. So he dies in 430, so this is in 410. And so now I'm a little sketchy here, but I don't think this is the first attack. I think there have been other attacks, but this was at the heart of Rome in 410. And Rome at this point is more symbolic, its role in the empire, than necessarily the center of power. I believe the center of power is shifted to Constantinople. There were two seats, one in the east and the west, and Rome was always sort of the preeminent seat. But over time, I believe Constantinople became more of the seat of power. But its attack in Rome, that they got that close to the heart of the empire, is really rattling them because of Rome's symbolic role. And therefore, he's reacting, he's responding to it, and specifically responding to claims that this new religion of the empire, as it were, is actually, one of the reasons for this sack in some either direct or indirect way. So he is responding essentially to pagan arguments that, this attack is due to Christianity, and hence that's his response.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll shift it to you. What did you make of book one? Because book one's interesting compared to what we've read thus far. I imagine you've got a totally different feel, not just on the religious component, but even just how it's written and what he's doing versus the other two. How did that hit you when you read this compared to the politics in the Republic?
So the first thing is more of how it's written. It's so I've noticed of I guess the books I don't even know if you call them books, because in Plato and Aristotle and in this they call what we might call chapters books. And then what's interesting about St. Augustine is he has these, what he calls chapters, are like a single paragraph or a couple paragraphs.
Sure.
Which is not anything I've seen before. And it's interesting because like each chapter, that what he calls a chapter, is focused on a single element, but the chapters flow from one to the next, to a degree. So the
especially the one on suicide, the section on suicide, that he's hitting all of these different subtopics on suicide, one after another.
Yes. So I guess there's a couple different larger themes in book one. Suicide being probably one of the larger ones in the middle towards the end.
Right.
I think so. When I was reading it, I was definitely more invested when I was reading that section. I don't know why, my brain just kind of turned on for that. So the first section I'm a bit more foggy towards.
Sure.
He definitely seems very well versed in, and he has a lot of quotes that he responds to.
Yeah.
Not all of which I'm familiar with.
Yeah, well versed in both the Roman pagan mythology and also the Judeo-Christian texts.
Yes,
right?
Definitely.
He's able to use those with great facility.
Yes. As to kind of overall of what I've read, I don't think there were really many points where I was like, I don't agree with this.
Sure. No, I can see that.
Yeah, so I think I agree with most of what he was saying. Yes. So I guess in the beginning of the book,
go for it.
he kind of, I guess, let me make sure I understand this correctly. The barbarians were claiming that they were Christian. Is that right?
No.
No.
No. I think what you have is that. See, I'm trying to think of an analogy, contemporary analogy, and 9/11 keeps coming to mind, where we have centers of the United States being attacked, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then after that attack, not by barbarians, but you know what I'm saying, by an outside group. And then after that, what happens is humans start pointing fingers.
Okay.
Right? The humans are like, why did this happen? I mean, it's so dramatic, right? 9/11 in particular. How could this happen? All of those kind of questions about why, why this time, why these places, why the hatred, so on and so forth. And then we start looking for answers.
Okay.
And my analogy back is that we've got the attack from the barbarians, but it's not as if the barbarians are attacking in the name of Christ.
Mm-hmm.
They're attacking for whatever their own purposes are.
Mm-hmm.
Which, and I'm unclear on, and if I pulled up another volume on this sacking, that might clear up some of it, right? But what I'm imagining, and this is the imagined part of the text that's not sort of explicit, is that other people, I'm guessing Roman citizens who are not fully on the Christian bandwagon, are blaming the Christian religion for the attack. So not that they were Christians that attacked them, but in some weird way, it's because we no longer believe in the pagan gods. It's because we no longer believe in the pagan ways that this has befallen us. And it's because we have this new religion. So in other words, it's sort of almost like, I don't know, like a weak excuse, or if you will, a scapegoating of the religion to account for the attack.
Okay, and kind of the reason they were pointing fingers is because the barbarians did end up respecting Christians and sparing their lives?
Exactly.
Okay.
Yes, exactly.
And do we know the motives behind that, or?
I do not know the motives behind that.
Okay.
I don't. See, it could be the case, and that's where I'm saying we would have to like crack open like a history of the sack that's separate from Augustine's account, right? To make sense of it.
Interesting.
Like what were their motivations in the attack? What were their and I would probably assume, and there's something rattling around the brain about it, that they have been disenfranchised by the empire in some particular way, politically, monetarily, something like that. But I don't know I don't know what their particular religious commitments were, right? At least we know with 9/11, you've got political issues at play, but you also have religious ones too. So we know that the attackers were part of this radical wing of Islam, and were utilizing that as sort of a war cry in going into the attack. But we also know that there are other sort of geopolitical things going on that prompted it as well. And I think that's the piece that we're sort of missing with the Visigoths.
Okay.
You know, I mean, other than the fact that, I mean, the other thing that comes to mind too is like, you know, you're an empire. You are encroaching on other lands. You're colonizing. That obviously they could take issue with, and also you're a big target.
Yeah.
You're a big target for other groups that are not within the empire. You know, but I am speculating.
Gotcha.
So my big thing about difference was that with Socrates and Plato, you don't have an obvious incident that's prompting their theories.
Right.
It's almost as if they're sort of like, hey, I want to develop a political theory. Right?
Yes.
And they are developing it, as it were, from the ground up. What we have with Augustine, at least in this book, the book we've read, is he is responding to an incident. He's not, and he's not interested in developing, at least at this point, a political theory from scratch, or even a political theory just from the Bible. Like, it's not just sort of like theory construction, which we find in the other two. So that is going to color things. You can. My issue was, I was like, where's the political theory? You know, and I think we're going to get that as he develops the distinction between the city of God and the city of man in subsequent readings.
Yeah.
But in this point, I was like, what is? It's almost like a prologue to that, based on the sacking of Rome and the accusations that are made against Christianity. So I had to like, as I was reading it, I had to sort of remind myself, like, this is different than what we've seen, but it still has political import because of it's a political attack. Actually, it's a political attacks, plural. Right? There's the actual one, and then there's the attack against the religion.
Yep.
You know, I mean, even in book one, like, first sentence, he says he's taken upon himself the task of defending the glorious city of God against those who prefer their own gods to the founder of that city, right? and then later he's like the city of this world. Actually, that's a good line. It's 2 paragraphs down. I don't know. We don't have the. It's the beginning of the 3rd paragraph of book 1. It says, "I cannot refrain from speaking about the city of this world, a city which aims at dominion, which holds nations in enslavement, but is itself dominated by the very lust of domination." So it's almost like that's his thesis, at least in this part. And I imagine as he distinguishes the city of God from the city of man, we're going to get more of that. What is his overall theory about how politics should work?
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
As I was reading it, I was like, so much of this sounds, not all of it, but a lot of it sounds like when he's specifically not addressing the barbarians or not addressing the accusers of Christianity, so much of it sounds like almost a manual in basic Christian theology.
Yeah.
What we do believe and what we don't believe, which is fine, but was still trying to make those political connections in my head. How is this sort of connected?
Yeah. So I think, let's see, at the beginning of the book, he's directly addressing the events of the barbarians in Rome and the Christians. He kind of transitioned. What is it? Was it chapter 5 and 6? I guess. How Romans who weren't necessarily Christians were fleeing to the churches to be protected, I guess.
Right.
And
Correct.
then were blaspheming the people in the churches, which is very hypocritical. And he kind of takes that and transitions into this idea of good and wicked, right? So
Right.
he's developing morals here.
Right.
Let's see. I'm trying to think. Okay, I mean, I don't know exactly where I'm trying to go with this, but there is one quote that I really liked.
Yeah.
Which was, so he was talking about how both good and wicked suffer, and they suffer in similar and same ways. And there's this part in chapter 8, for as the same fire causes gold to glow brightly and chaff to smoke, under the same flail the straw is beaten small, while grain is cleansed, and the lees are not mixed with the oil, though squeezed out of the vat by the same pressure. So the same violence of affliction proves, purges, clarifies the good, but damns, ruins, exterminates the wicked. I just think that's a very interesting thing to bring up, because I think people can struggle with the idea that people everyone suffers, and it's it affects people in different ways, and this really brings out something that is it's like a growth, like a trial, instead of being something that beats you down.
That's big for him.
Yeah.
Two things come to mind. Well, 3 things. One is this whole idea that I'm butchering the paraphrase here, but it's sort of like the sun shines on both the evil and the wicked, or I'm sorry, the good and the evil.
Yes.
Or the good and the wicked. I remember growing up in the Reformed tradition, and there was this notion of, I think it's called common grace, sort of like God allows sort of the good and the bad to happen to all kinds of people. Obviously, there's, in Augustine's language, sometimes you really have done something bad, and you get a direct curse for it, even if you're a Christian, right? But the other element that I was thinking was that this is part of his answer to the problem of suffering / the problem of evil, of a test. That comes up a lot in this section, where he deals with this issue that God, he looks at Job as an example, right? Especially with the issue of suicide. He could have taken his life, but what was actually going on was this overall spiritual test that he had to, ultimately overcome, and in the end, is the better for it.
Mm-hmm.
So he does include that notion of why do we suffer? Why do we have evil? These things occur, not sort of randomly, or not in a meaningless way, but it's always within the context of, if you will, sort of spiritual evolution.
Right.
And I think I said three things. One of his big issues, at least in the Confessions, is the problem of evil.
Mm-hmm.
So if God is all good, all powerful, all knowing, why does evil exist? That sort of philosophical nut, and it's hard to crack. And this is one of his attempts. He has another attempt at it, which is really interesting. We can go there if you want, but
is the one you're talking about the idea of the two cities and finally being separated at the end, or is that different? Or is that the same idea?
This was very metaphysical,
Okay.
or even actually ontological, dealing with the ontology is a subset of metaphysics, and it deals with the question of being. And he basically argues that since from the foundation of creation, everything was created good, right? So God is good. God creates. He looks at it. He says it's good. Humans are good by nature, so on and so forth. That the way to resolve the problem of evil is actually able to. It's actually not a solution. He dissolves the problem of evil, because he ends up arguing that in the Confessions that evil actually has no, and I'll explain this, ontological status. That means that he means by that it actually doesn't truly exist. What he means, the way he gets at that is if everything in the universe is goodness, God, and what God creates, right?
Okay.
Then evil can only really be understood as what he calls a privation of good. So when there is a lack of goodness, we call that evil. But in the scheme of things, evil doesn't have its own standing. So it's not like evil sort of exists over there as an entity. It is something that is always sort of preying on levels of goodness. So when you are not as good as you could have been, that is a kind of evil. When but let's put it this way, there would be no evil at all if there was no good, because it preys on it.
Right.
The analogy I used to give in class is like the rot on an apple. So the rot is not a thing. You can see it, but it's not a thing. It is the removal. It is the lack of what was there, and that's how he sees it. So he's able to sort of excuse God, as it were, by being the author of evil, because it doesn't really exist.
Interesting.
As a thing.
That's very interesting. I'd be curious to read into that a bit more later.
Yeah, no doubt. So, but in this context, he sees all these things happening with not so much that response to evil. He sees it, because he says it, as more of a spiritual challenge. Job's the best example of that, right? Because, he gets all these challenges, and then they all wonder what's going on and what's wrong with him, and it has to be him, it has to be a problem with him. But through that whole process, he becomes stronger. He passes the test, which is a very Judeo-Christian notion, right? Even it's not so much evil in this case, but like Abraham having to sacrifice his son. Can he pass this test? Can he prove his faith? So yeah. So I feel like in the beginning of book one, he does address sort of the attack, and then we segue to, if you will, sort of like Christian theology.
Yep.
And as it were, sort of up against Roman pagan mythology. Um, and even getting into things like, sort of ethics, right?
Mm-hmm.
Sort of like, this is how a Christian ought to live, and this is what a Christian ought to do, or what a Christian should avoid. And then it seems like toward the very end, after all of the talk about suicide, um, and and I should note as well, suicide in the Roman Empire was actually seen as an honorable act, not as an escape or something that the weak individual does. Like this, there was actually great virtue, according to the Romans, to take one's life. So you can see how he would be responding to that. And I was wondering, like, why is he on this topic so much? But it could be the case that some people did actually take their lives. I'm not sure. Some Christians
Mm-hmm.
during the sack, if they were threatened, I guess. But that doesn't really square with the fact that the barbarians seem to allow a refuge for Christians in the temples, right?
Right.
But anyway, but the Christian notion of suicide or position on suicide is very different from the one practiced among sort of the virtuous man in the Roman Empire. And then toward the end, he starts to get back to the idea about this attack. So I feel like I know he discusses it in the middle section as well, but I feel like it's in the opening, and then even just looking at the titles of the sections, right? Section 34, the mercy of God in moderating the city's destruction. Uh, 33, the vices of the Romans were not corrected by their country's overthrow. So he seems to sort of, go back to some of this. Also, too, I think it was in section 31 when he talks about the stages of corruption, that he seems to look back at an earlier period of Roman history and says we were sort of on the right track, even if we didn't have the Christian component, right? Because, just to be clear, the empire or Rome's existence runs roughly from 753 BC, like at its very founding, like with kings, before you get an emperor and before you get a senate.
Mm-hmm.
So 753 BC and it finally falls in 476 AD. It's a long, long run. So he seems to be pointing back at times to in an earlier moment of Rome where we were sort of doing things right, especially in that section on 31. And then we became more and more corrupt. And by the way, he's not the only one to criticize Rome on this. There were other critics even before Augustine that were talking about the excess of the empire and that how the morals had been corrupted and changed and altered over time. I think in that one section 31, second paragraph, middle of, he's like, he's talking about a particular king and that did not allow Greek corruption to infiltrate into the virile morality of Rome and to have no truck with foreign depravity, which would undermine and weaken the Roman moral character. So he looks at sort of an earlier time where we were a little bit more on target than later.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, there's a lot in this book, and it's tricky to know what to jump on. But anyway.
Yeah.
I think, too, that, as I'm just flipping through and seeing, once again, all of the topics on suicide, I think too, this is, it's, we're living so long after this, and the two of us having grown up within the Christian tradition, we're very comfortable with the position of the immorality of suicide, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think that was crystal clear at the time, and it must not have been, given how much ink he spills on the topic.
Yeah.
So you know what I'm saying? Like, Christianity's been around. Well, it's been around for 400 years in the empire, but in terms of it being a legal religion, even like under 100 years. It's not long. So you imagine that all of the pagan practices, which had a much longer run in the empire, are still alive and well, even if they're suppressed.
Mm-hmm.
It's just in the zeitgeist and intermingled with the new legal religion. So that he spent so much time on it makes me think that people they didn't know, or they didn't fully understand sort of the Christian position, and he spends the time that he does, on suicide as he does. Like, that's why I'm guessing he would be doing that.
Yeah. It's interesting. So, do you think that in modern society that most of I that most religions or beliefs around the world um have the same kind of idea about suicide, or are there current cultures that have the same thoughts as the pagans did before, or do you think that this view's kind of penetrated?
My sense is that other than in there's honorable killings in I think in ancient Japanese practice,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like
Was
slitting
that
open
restricted
belly.
to times of war though?
That might have been, and also when you said modern,
Mm-hmm.
so I don't know, do you know what I'm saying? I mean, I know that there's actually, interestingly enough, my short story reading with Diedrich this week from The Future is Japanese was actually on the suicide forest in Japan, and I did some side reading because I've heard about it before, on the rates of suicide in Japan versus other first world countries,
Mm-hmm.
and it's sort of shocking, So, but I don't know that it would be justified from a religious perspective. And from my encounters, studying and teaching world religions, it's generally taboo.
Right.
There's generally a morality. Yeah, it's generally considered immoral.
Right.
For the Greeks, there wasn't really a fear of death, at least in the heroic literature, right? Your Achilles and your Iliad and the Trojan War. I mean, it's just like, to be afraid of death is weak, a weak trait.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm finishing up the Odyssey right now, or I'm sorry, the Iliad right now with kids, and by the way, the retelling for the kids is even pretty explicit, so it's not like they would skip this part.
Mm-hmm.
But there's no suicide. There's no one commits suicide.
Right.
So it'd be interesting to see how that developed within the Roman period, because I know that it was relatively common among, I believe, even emperors, if not emperors, and certainly people in a very high level of leadership, and not for the sort of the typical reasons that we hear about with assisted suicide, where life is hard, or you're terminally ill. But there's an element of if there is the right time for your particular reasons, which are all based on this type of hyper masculine morality that the Greeks had, then it is honorable. Buddhism, Hinduism, Islam, Christianity, Judaism. from my grasp of it, none of the modern forms of that endorse it.
Right.
I don't want to say it's unique, with the Romans. It could have been another ancient culture. But yeah, it sort of makes me think that he's really pressing this point, because part of reading this, and again, it's because we are both so familiar with Christian theology and morality. It just seemed like, why is he harping on this? We know this, but we do, not everyone that is his audience. The other thing I was going to say, as it relates to politics, is that we know he's going to develop this dualism between the city of man and the city of God. Okay, or well, I know. And you have some sense, right? I already think that we see this in this book, even though it's not explicit. And what I mean by that is, whenever he's talking about the pagans, whenever he's talking about pagan morality, the pagan stories, I believe we're already getting a sketch of the city of man.
Okay.
And then when he's answering the objection, right? Because some of the sections he opens up with, it might be said, or I have heard it said, or this accusation has been made, and then he responds to it. Then you're getting the sketch of the city of God. Do you understand?
Yeah.
So it's not as if, it's not as if he's entirely done away with, or I'm sorry, we're getting no sense of these particular cities. And I raise this because the cities, detailing what the cities look like, are going to be part of his theory, right? And ergo will look something like Plato and Aristotle, meaning, in other words, like here's what politics should look like. I feel like you can look at book one as him already doing that, like without being explicit, like, hey, this is the city of God, this is the city of city of man. It's like, no, whenever he is speaking about the Roman ways that we've seen thus far, we're getting a sense of what it is, which is, even when he was talking about dominion at the beginning of the section, right? And sort of a lust for power, that these things are going to be the mark of the city of man. But when you start getting things like devotion to God, worship, prayer, humility, things like that, you're starting to get a sketch of the city of God. So that's it dawned on me when I was reading. I was like, oh, this is one way to already start to see sort of his initial take on these cities.
Yes. And let's see. So in chapter 35 at the end, he says, let's see, in truth, these two cities are entangled together in this world and intermixed until the last judgment affect their separation. So he's mentioning them too, not necessarily by name. He mentions the city of God by name in the same paragraph. I don't know if does he mention city of man?
No, I don't know if in that passage, but I know in the he talks about the other city in book one, which we referenced earlier.
Yes.
The city dominated by the lust for power.
Yeah. So it looks like the exact phrase "city of man" is not used in the translation I'm looking at.
In book one. Okay.
Yeah.
In book one?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, and so book one, I think you're probably right. So book one, what I read before, I cannot refrain from speaking about the city of this world, the city which aims at dominion, which holds nations in enslavement. but is itself dominated by the very lust of domination, right? Which would be true of the Roman Empire, which would be true of any empire that wants to colonize, but would not be true of the city of God, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where the one, you're probably not going to have the word lust, and you're probably not going to have the notion of domination, at least by humans, right? You have a sovereign God, but you don't have, you ought not to have just a quest for dominion, you know?
Mm-hmm.
So yes, my use of the city of man, I'm sorry, comes out of just like whatever, having read this before, granted years ago,
Mm-hmm.
and then knowing whatever in my Augustine reading, aside from this, that these are the dualism that he develops. It'll be interesting too to see as he develops this where what we could extrapolate or where our conversation goes about the separation of church and state, because you don't have that at his time, right? Church is state, state is church. And you don't have that even after he dies during the Middle Ages. You know, you find that notion sort of creep up later as governments become more secular and, well, actually, when nation states arrive, I want to say 1600s, possibly 1500s, but 1600s, where you have more nation states, and then and then also you have secularism start to arise, thanks to things like the scientific revolution and things like that, and then those bodies become separated.
Mm-hmm.
But it'll be interesting because you have the dualism, city of man, city of God, or we will have that develop, and that should make us, prompt a thought about, well, when it comes to the Declaration of Independence and our reading of the Constitution later, about the separation of the two, a respect for the one or for both, but a separation of the two, because you don't. I mean, I think he probably would have laughed at the notion, right, of the separation of those two.
Yeah, probably.
But at the same point, the fact that he separates them, at least politically or religiously or spiritually, does warrant, a question about church-state relations.
Mm-hmm. Well, here's a question. So you mentioned this separation, and he'll probably get into it later, but I guess what exactly is being separated? Like, does he include the moral aspect, like human rights aspect, in both, or only in one?
That is a good question to ask as we move throughout, because I'm not sure.
Because if he only attributes it to the city of God, then that analogy does not fit with our current system.
Correct. No, I agree.
Mm-hmm.
My sense is that from what we've gotten in book one about, let's just put it this way, the different characteristics of these cities, that we're going to continue to get further characteristics. And I think even there's one section on the origin of the cities, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which I imagine is going to have a spiritual component, possibly something like, like paradise being the origin of the city of man or city of God, but something like the casting out of the garden or, the Tower of Babel, something like that being sort of like on the city. So I feel like there's going to be this sort of like spiritual distinction between the two. When it comes down to like how they incorporate, right, in life or realpolitik, I think there's going to be some interesting things to discover there, because you could look at sort of the descriptions from a spiritual level and be like, okay, yes, ultimately the city of God is going to end up in ultimate paradise, in the afterlife with God, and the city of man at that point will be nothing, will be reduced to rubble. But what are the implications from when I'm alive right now and I'm living within a particular empire or nation?
Mm-hmm.
How do I apply what I've learned about both of these cities to contemporary politics as I have to live them as a citizen, even
Yep.
if I want to be, even if I consider myself a citizen of the city of God? Like how's that going to play out?
Mm-hmm.
Like, for instance, in the specifics that you're bringing up about separation of church and state, that's a real world daily, well, it's not daily, but has daily ramifications.
Yeah.
So,
So I mean,
there, how
uh,
they're related, I think, is going to be interesting to discover.
yeah, and I assume that the discussion of this book is not necessarily going to get into types of government like Plato and Aristotle did. Um,
Right.
so that aspect will be interesting too. Maybe we can, as we're understanding some of these differences that he's bringing out, see how they apply to the different types of government.
Yeah. Totally. Totally. I mean, it'll be interesting too because we still have, at least in the Middle East, you still have theocracy. You
Mm-hmm.
know. So I mean, allegedly. So that element will be interesting too. Like, would I mean, it seems like he would say yes to this, but I'm not sure. Um, would he endorse a type of theocracy? Where you do have state religion, and everything needs to be guided by that religion and its founding text.
Mm-hmm.
I'm hesitant on it because, again, I mean, I'm hesitant on it because what role then? Where's the city of man in that? Right.
Yeah.
In other words, is the city of man even necessary,
Right.
or is it just that you can actually trump the city of man um, by doing your best to impose a type of theocracy, or if you will, a city of God?
Right. I think
Um,
what you'd find is if you did that, either it becomes like very theoretical and like kind of like the Philosopher King aspect where it all works
sure.
well, or
Yeah.
it goes more empirical and you're like, well, yeah, you'd have that theocracy, but then you'd have so which would be the city of God, but you'd still have the city of man intermixed in there, um,
Yeah.
maybe kind of hidden, and it wouldn't be easily observable. And I think
Right.
that's kind of what he's getting at in that chapter 35, where he's talking about the intermingling of the two, and then they're separated at the end. Like you don't necessarily
Yeah.
know, it's not
Yeah.
something you can easily discern the difference of all the time, the city of God and the city of man. Um, I'm sure there's instances where it's really easy, but there's got to be instances where it's not. Um,
Yeah.
but yeah, I think
Exactly. And
that's
see,
that's
that's
kind of
the
what would
thing
happen.
too. Yeah. Like, I'm wondering too. Like, so let's say concrete and abstract. So
Yeah.
how concrete are these things in a real life state?
Hmm.
And then also, or is the case that they're a little bit more abstract or spiritual?
Right.
Sorry. So that's like, in other words, it's like, um, yeah, like, so it's not necessarily like a whatever. There's a constitution for the city of God, and we're going to implement that. But it's more like, you can have both intermingling within a particular state, regardless of the constitution, because one's driven by, if you will, the lust of the flesh, and the other one is driven by devotion to God.
Hmm.
So you could be a member of the city of God, um, uh, sort of spiritually, as opposed to like a truly implemented theocracy or something like that.
Yeah.
But
Like
those are very interesting questions to
yeah.
pose.
Yeah. Like
You
you
know?
could have a
Yeah, go on.
like you can have a theocratic ruler um, that, has the laws of the religion, but doesn't
Uh-huh.
necessarily, like, maybe not all of the laws, so that there is kind of not necessarily a separation, maybe a separation.
Hmm.
I don't know, I'm thinking of a situation where um, it's governed like kind of like the Constitution, but not necessarily. Like it's governed by the rules or mandates of a religion,
Right.
but not every aspect is mandatory, I guess.
Sure.
Right? That
Yeah,
would allow
exactly.
both.
Right. Right. Yeah. The other thing I was going to add is that, one of the conversations that we've had since the Republic is the role of, yeah, no, since the Republic, sure, but I would add maybe it was really pushed with Aristotle because we raised this question about the function of the city for Aristotle, and the function of the city
Mm-hmm.
was to make men virtuous.
Yep.
And you and I were kicking around at that time, like how odd, like how, like from a 21st century American perspective, if, and I think we even phrased like if, if the government said, we actually want to make you virtuous, we'd balk, you because we have a like sort of, I don't want to say a lower standard, but like a different orientation to what it means to be a good citizen. Obey the laws, pay your taxes.
Right.
But that is not what's going on with Aristotle. Plato, I just need to think about it a little bit more. It's certainly not going on with Augustine, because Augustine talks about the declining morality and that there needs to be a moral component within the state, within citizens, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and that that it'll just be continue to be interesting to see how this develops and who drops it, if anyone drops it, down the road of our reading, where it ends up becoming more. No, everyone has their own freedom to develop themselves. The role of the state is just security and protection,
Hmm.
right? You
Yep.
but there's something refreshing, I think, about hearing, especially I think in 2020, right? But there's something refreshing about hearing your Aristotle or your Augustine. Hey, there really should be a moral component to life within a state, and not just a legal one, right? It's
Yeah.
not the legal is just here's the law, you have to abide by it. Don't do the really bad things, kind of things. But this is more, I think, more subtle. Of whatever, developing the virtues as understood in the Greco-Roman world, or if you will, with Augustine, the Christian virtues.
Mm-hmm.
You know, um, so yeah, it's another thing that sort of strikes me.
Yeah, I would be curious about that too. I think so. I think Plato does kind of have this idea. It's kind of
Yeah,
weird because it's hidden behind the lie of the metals. Um,
right.
so you have to kind of juxtapose it with that. But like they want virtuous people, um, be, because like I mean the ruler is the philosopher king and he needs to be virtuous. Um,
Right. True. True.
and yeah,
Yeah.
it's a little bit different, but
And
I think it's there.
philosophical. Yeah. Yeah. You're absolutely right. I mean, there's it's I think when it comes to Machiavelli, our next book is going to just that notion is going to be trashed, because basically immorality is going to be praised if it's advantageous to the leader. So maybe we start to see a transition then.
Interesting.
you know. But my sense is that with Hobbes and Locke and the social contract theory, now by their time you have the rise, you have the scientific revolution, you have the rise of the sciences, you have therefore a also a rise of skepticism toward religion, hidden, because it still had to be hidden at times, atheist commitments and agnostic commitments. So you wonder, like, my sense is with social contract theory, it's just going to be uh, safety, security, you know,
Hmm.
and provision, let's say. But you're going to lose the moral component, and it's interesting why that would be the case. of missing that, because as we talked about before, you know, you're not politicians aren't going to come across as immoral because they know they won't get voted into office, right?
Right.
So by and large, so it's there within our sort of political thinking, but it's not there explicitly. You know, it still rests on the legal notion: did you break a law or not? Not you have a corrupt soul, or you are a vicious person, or you were virtuous. You know,
Right.
so good. I would say this was a good discussion. I was curious how we were going to go about it.
Mm-hmm.
So um, just because it felt so different from the first two.
Yeah, definitely.
So
Yeah, I think we
good.
definitely have some things to look at when we go through the next
Yeah.
chapters that we'll be going through. Um,
Uh,
so I'm curious about that.
totally. Yeah. Totally. Um, no, I'm interested. It's been a while. Actually, it's been 20 years since I read it. So,
Wow.
because I read it at St. John. It was actually a special class on just the City of God.
Okay.
So, and it was a whole semester long. But again, that was 20 years ago.
Yeah. Cool.
Awesome, man. Well, thank you for the discussion, and thank you for your input
Absolutely. It was
and
definitely
the back
good.
and forth. Good. We'll do it next week. By the way, where
Yep.
are you posting these?
They're on YouTube on my channel.
You have a channel?
Yes.
What's your channel? Is it
It's
Christian Mischke?
Christian Mischke. Yep.
Okay. All right. I'll check it out.
Yep.
Is it open, or do you have to subscribe? Or
It's open. It's open.
okay. Awesome. I'll check it out.
Yep.
All right. Have a good one, man.
All right. You too.
Cheers.
Cheers.